4-inch 5G TIG weld. So to kick it off, the first thing we need to do is take our die grinder, and we're going to clean out the inside of the pipe. We want to get rid of all the rust and debris that's inside there, and then we'll be ready for the root pass, or for fit up. All right. Alrighty. So you can see that inside of here, we've cleaned all of the rust and debris from the very edge of that weld. That way our root, when it goes in, it doesn't get all dirtied up. We have a little bit more to do on the top where I missed some of it. It's super important that when you're cleaning that off, we don't start to put a back bevel inside of the pipe here. That back bevel can make it so that when they x-ray the pipe, it's kind of hard to tell if the root's good or not. So now we'll get the next piece ready. It's also important that when you clean the outside of the pipe, we don't remove a bunch of material. We want to leave all of the steel on there. We just want to take off all of the coating and the mill scale that comes from the factory. So now we're going to stand this thing up into a 2G position. And that makes it much easier to fit up. Is it going to be muffled when my hood's down if I talk? Okay. So for fit up, we need an 1/8 inch spacer in between the top weld, or the top piece of pipe, and the bottom piece of pipe. So I'd like to just bend a piece of TIG wire to make a spacer, and I like to set it on there. Then I like to clip the tails off of this spacer so that I can weld in between them without messing up the angle of my TIG torch. And it's really important that there's no landing on this piece of pipe, and that it's just a nice knife edge. If there is a burr, we want to remove the burr off that piece too. We have a little bit of one right there. So I'm going to quick get that burr off. Okay. So now we have our 1/8 inch spacer, and we have our top piece of pipe. And we just want to make sure that the whole inside of this pipe lines up really nice. And if it's impossible to line up, then we'll just split the difference. And now we're ready to tack it. So when I tack for the root, I like to have just a little bit more stick out than the radius of the cup, so I can reach all the way down into that root. If your stick out's too short, then you're going to suck your root back. So, like that. Then I take a piece of 1/8 inch wire and I like to feel inside of this bevel, and anywhere my wire slips through, I know that I'm too wide for a lay wire root. So I look for a spot that my wire doesn't quite slip through, but still 1/8 of an inch. So right there on the front, on this one, the wire doesn't quite slip through, but it still looks like it's going to be very close to 1/8 of an inch. So I have my gas right at, right around 50. We'll turn it down just a little bit. Set my gas right to 40 CFH. Now I like to grab the tail of this TIG torch so that it doesn't swing side to side when I walk. And for this first tack, I'm just going to strike up on the bottom bevel and then jump to the top bevel and attach my wire to the top bevel. But I don't strike up on the top bevel because I worry about moving this pipe around when I bump into the pipe. So here we go. My machine is set to 90 amps right now. It seems to be a nice, comfortable temperature to put a root in. Immediately dip the tungsten on that one. There we go. Now I like to check my fit up again after I take my spacer out. Sometimes this pipe will rotate just a little bit, and you have to be careful that you catch it and twist it back, or else your alignment will be off. So I'm going to spin this. Now for the second tack, I like to just open this a little bit and feel it with my wire. And I'll close it, keep feeling it with my wire until it feels like it's the perfect gap. And that tack on the back is holding this gap open right now. Don't want to forget to clip the wire. It's really important on a root that you don't burn the numbers end of the wire because it's flattened. And when the wire's flattened, a lot of times it will keyhole and your root will open up. And if you're not good at keyhole dab or backfeed, that can become a pretty big problem. So I'm going to tack this front side now. Always tack straight across from your first tack, 180 degrees. So here we go. Now this one I latch the top on first. And then I slide in a straight line and I break off. Now the most important thing is that when I look down the bevels, both sides have the same amount of gap on them. So I just sight down this side and down that side and check for the same amount of gap. We definitely don't want there to be any spot where this wire can fall through the pipe, because when we get there it's going to cause problems for us. So I'll put pressure on this wire. Right there it falls through. That's just a tiny bit right at the end. So if I weld that last, then that'll be okay. I'll be able to twist the wire just a little bit. We'll turn it sideways so it doesn't fall through. Feed a tiny bit, and it'll be okay. But anything towards the beginning of the weld is not going to be any fun to weld through that gap because it'll start to fall out on you. So for running the root, I like to use a 6 cup, and I'm going to put my last 2 tacks in with this in the 5G position. I always use 4 tacks when I make a weld because it takes 4 tacks to keep it straight. if this is a 90 and we don't tack both these sides, we can twist off, and that can become a big problem. So to keep my alignment all perfect, I always do 4 tacks. But right now I have an 8 cup on, so I'm going to switch it to a 6 cup. Now I have to adjust my stick out for the 6 cup. And always check to make sure that I can reach all the way down to where the knife edges are on this bevel. If my tungsten don't reach far enough down, then I'll long arc, and that'll become a big problem. So I'm going to turn this heat down. 90 was a little bit spicy today, so I'm going to pump it down just a little bit. And then I'm going to grab a fresh new wire. Then I'm going to put my tacks in, and then we'll be ready for the root. And when you put this root in, if you go really wide, then your root will come in pretty flat. But if you don't go really wide, it'll usually be pretty narrow. So I usually go almost straight up the center. I never weave wider than the wire, and usually end up with a pretty nice looking root in there. It's really good to grind your tacks. We've had some students go take no grind tests where they weren't allowed to grind their tacks. So I'm not going to today. I'm just going to tie in. I'll show you how to tie in without grinding. Just slip over here and put this tack in. This spot's a little bit wider, so I'm going to turn the wire to the side. That way we don't end up falling through and ending up with cold wire in our root. All right, that's looking good. Okie dokie. So always clip the wire. So we don't want to get all that gray nasty stuff that's on the end of this wire. We don't want to get any of that in the root. The end of that wire is ruined. So I clip it all the way till where the discoloration is gone. Same with this one. Alrighty. So the trick to tying in without grinding your tacks is when I get to a tack, I'm going to stand my wire straight up and down so that the wire is riding at the front of the tack all the way down to where the knife edges are. And then as soon as that piece melts in, I'll pull my wire out and walk up onto the tack to tie in. And to start, I'm just going to keyhole right at the tip of the tack on the start tack, and once it's nice and liquid, I'll add my wire, and that's how I tie in on the start. So we'll run this bottom portion of root here. The reason I like to use a 6 cup is because it slides really nicely in the bevels on this 4-inch. And an 8 cup, it'll start to get catchy and it'll pop up out of the bevels. And when it does that, it forces a long arc in that spot, and sometimes that'll keyhole and ruin the whole day. So I keyhole, Add wire. Now I'm just flipping side to side a little bit to free up the friction of this cup on the bevels. And I'm trying to move fast enough that I don't overheat, but slow enough that my root goes in nice and flat. On my side of the pipe, I don't want to see a big crown, and I don't want to see it be concaved either. And once I see that tack coming, or if I feel it, I'll stand this wire up, just like that. And tie that in nice, right there. Now every time I get done welding, I hold the gas on the spot that's glowing red on the pipe until I see it quit glowing red. That way, while that metal is unstable and it reacts to oxygen really bad, there will be argon replacing the oxygen so that we don't gray out our tie-ins really bad. All our starts and stops, you don't want to gray out. So now I'm going to come across the top, same thing. So once I see a nice keyhole, I add this wire, and then the top gap's a little bit tighter than the bottom one was, so I'm just going to go nice and slow in a straight line here to get it to penetrate. So I'm just wiggling right to the outside of the wire and keeping my arc super tight as I come around the top. Everything's looking good so far. Jump to this side. I had a set of vice grips in here. So on this side, I like to clamp vice grips on here to rest my wrist on, and that keeps my wrist from getting way too hot. And it makes it so that I can really stabilize this wire. There we go. Especially when I get to that top section where our gap's a little bit wide, I start worrying about this thing falling through, and I can really keep good control of the wire because I'm braced up all the way to the palm of my hand up here. That's all looking pretty good now, though. As you weld, the gap shrinks and the weld shrinks. So that can be really helpful if your gap starts out a little bit too wide. And it can really be kind of a pain if your gap starts out a little too narrow. So. Now, if you have to slide your wire in the bevels, it's really important that you give it a little twist. And if you don't give it a little bit of a twist, sometimes it'll jerk forward really badly. And it's no fun. It'll stuff into your puddle and leave cold wire and mess up your weld in that area. Now as I come up this pipe, I'm really careful not to start long arcing. That'll lead to some big keyhole problems. Right here's a pretty big keyhole, get that sealed up. We're good to go. Okay. Almost done with this root. This root has a pen line. I'll show it to you here in a second. A pen line is pretty cool to see on a root, and if you see it on your hot pass, it's not a good sign. It's not the worst thing ever, but it means that your hot pass was swirling or liquid. And we don't want to liquefy our hot pass, we just want to get it really, really hot to make sure everything ties in. So. I got a little bit of a keyhole there. Let's tie that in. Tornado off. So, take a look in here. Okay, here's that pen line that I was talking about. It's right on the outside here. You can see a line that goes right up the center of that root. And the inside's looking pretty good. We have a little bit of a glob in there, but nothing severe. Okay, time for the hot pass. So before we move on to the next pass, we like to brush this pass really good with a wire brush. We don't like to use wire wheels. A lot of times they have oil in them, and we don't want to get that oil on the weld. Or if they're not brand new, then they've been used on other applications, like somebody's old bumper or a nasty piece of pipe. So I like to just take a nice clean wire brush and brush all of the soot and smoke and little silica beads off of this thing. It's not 100% necessary, but it does help keep the weld clean throughout the whole process. Okay. For the hot pass, I like to turn up to 110, but this machine's running pretty spicy. So I'm going to turn down a little bit. I'm going to go 105. So hot passes, you can run them really hot or pretty cold. It doesn't matter, but if you're really hot, then you really want to pour the heat into the bevels and not into the root. If you're running colder, just want to make sure that you're really tying in the edges of the root. So I'm going to run a little bit colder today to avoid making mistakes. And we'll get started here. So I'm still running the 6 cup for the hot pass, and then I'll switch to the 8 cup when I get to the fill pass in the cap. So. Now while I'm running this hot pass, I'm making sure I don't take too big of a step because I want to make sure that all of the toe line of the root gets heat soaked into it. And I'm also making sure I go fast enough that I don't start to suck the root out and really get a lot of metal in my bevels. The suck back on the root is really kind of a bad deal. My goal usually is to make it from the bottom to the top without stopping. It's not necessary, but it can really help the feel of your weld if you don't have a start-stop in it. And if you run out of room for your hand on this wire, a simple technique to get more wire is just to let the wire freeze in the puddle and then slide your hand back. Perfect.
What direction are you going?
Am I spinning my torch? Well, in the hot pass, I spin opposite of walk. So if I'm moving to the right, the top of the cup is going to move to the left. So I'm just sliding in the bevels versus a walk where I would move the top of the cup the same direction I want the tungsten to go. Also, very light pressure. If you get too much pressure, it'll really get hard to hold on to that cup. It'll slide up out of the bevels. So the amount of pressure you have on the end of the cup should be about as much as you have on the tip of a pen when you're writing. Maybe a tiny bit more, but not much. Now I like to brush my starts and stops so I can tie into the other side. My vice grips again. I usually take the vice grips off because when I don't need them, because they'll heat up with the pipe and then they don't do me any good when they're hot as the pipe is. So, alrighty. You see, when I hold this TIG torch on the bottom, I hold it like this. That helps keep my wrist at an angle that I can maneuver it, versus when I get it up like this, it gets real stiff. And then when I get to about, I don't know, 4 o'clock here, I switch and grab onto the torch with my whole hand. So that can make the bottom quite a bit easier. Oops. That's a dipped tungsten. So when you dip the tungsten, look at the tungsten and make sure that the tip of it's still there. If it's not, then you have a piece of tungsten in your weld that you need to grind out. There we go. Now the faster we weld, the less fill we get. And the slower we weld, the more it sucks metal in off of that root and off the bevel walls. So if one area after the hot pass starts to be pretty low, you can slow down through that area, you'll start to fill. So we have an even fill past the gap over. It's not going to move a lot though. So it's not enough to fix mistakes, but you can slowly get it to grow out of one side or the other. So now it's back to brushing. Now a TIG weld, it can get too hot. The pipe can, and when it gets too hot, it starts to wreck the metal. Carbon isn't nearly as critical as stainless. And we're welding carbon today, so we're just going to weld straight on through. But we are going to have to start turning our heat down to compensate for never letting this pipe rest. And there's what that hot pass looks like. There's the bottom tie-in. There's the top.
Can you get a little closer?
There. How's our time? How's our time?
3:31.
Alrighty, for the fill pass, I'm going to switch to an 8 cup. Now it's important that we switch out these cups. This one that's coming off is hot, and the one that's going on is cold. So we don't want to tighten it too much, because if we keep tightening them, there's different temperatures. Sometimes this cup will get on there so good that it never comes off. You have to break it to get it off. So we just go not even quite hand tight, just snug, not even snug, just enough that it's not falling off. Check our tungsten. So now I should still be able to glide pretty good on these bevels, but I might get to a spot where it starts getting tough or it starts skipping a lot. If that happens, then I'll just pick up the cup on one bevel, and then I'll pivot it, and then I'll set it down on the other bevel and pick it up off the first bevel and then pivot it. And I'll just kind of walk up this thing by pivoting on the edges of the bevels.
Can you call out your weld filter that you're working on?
4-inch 5G carbon TIG out, 1/8 inch carbon wire. All right, so we're on the bottom here. We want to make sure that we get far enough back that we don't hose ourselves when we get to the other side. It's called short arming. And this very bottom can be really uncomfortable. While we're walking up this thing, we want to make sure that you start in a position that you can get stood up, or else you're going to have a start-stop on the side. And it's pretty hard to get those ripples to line up on your restarts there. Okay, so we have quite a bit of fills to put in on this thing. So I'm just going to stick to this one side here, or else we're going to end up running out of time. So I'll do a cascading. We'll step back each time. Now as we move out and we get more and more fills in, I like to pull my tungsten in just a tiny bit each time, so that way my wrist motion stays pretty close to the same. So. We want to remember to brush. And while we're brushing, we're going to look for anything that looks weird. If we see a spot that missed or anything concerning, we'll stop, and that's the time to repair it. Most of the time on TIG, if something's wrong, you can just hit it with a little bit of heat and sweat it in. But sometimes, if it's bad enough, you have to get out the grinder. So. Alrighty. I'll jump over to that other side. I decided. One of the most critical things in TIG welding is to be smooth. Smooth is fast, and it's neat. So we want to try to find a rhythm. But sometimes during these fill passes, it's almost impossible to find a rhythm. If we don't move the wire, we always put the same amount of wire in. When we get to the cap, if it's a little bit rough, we can always fix it. If we start moving the wire around, moving it up and down and trying to fill in this spot or that spot, when we get to the cap, a lot of times it gets really hard to fix that weld. Now there is more techniques to filling these. Some guys feed wire into their puddle with the tram fill, it's called. Well, we like to teach to just lay the wire down and melt it with the puddle, and that gives you a very consistent fill, and it's pretty risk-free. Now it's important when you get to the end of your weld, don't just snap off. Make sure that you start to long arc and slowly walk forward, and you'll shrink up that puddle, then pull off. Or another method is to get over on the bevel wall, and some people like to break off on the bevel wall. If you do that, you have to do it pretty slowly. And once you get further into the fill passes, the bevel wall shrinks more and more, and it gets a lot harder to break off on the wall. Now the way to determine how many fill passes you need is fill it until it's completely flush, and if it's just a tiny bit below flush and you're unsure if you need another fill pass, put a fill pass in there, because it's okay for it to be just a little bit above flush. A little bit lower than flush usually leads to undercut. So, I'm going to slap another fill in here. stick out. Feels pretty good now. Now when we put in this last fill pass, we want to bump into the toe lines of our bevel, but we don't want to break down the shoulder of the bevel. We're going to need that shoulder when it comes time to put in our cap. We don't want to disrupt it too much, but it is okay to bump into it. Right now this is looking like it's going to be the final fill pass. It's filling us right up to the shoulder of that bevel. Nice and flat. Now we don't want to see the puddle all the way across the weld. We want that puddle to be following the tungsten. So, if the puddle's getting too wide, it's all the way across the weld, then start moving through the middle a lot faster and slow down on the sides just a little bit until that puddle starts following your tungsten across the weld again. If that don't work, then turn down. It's pretty common for the top of a weld to come in lower than the bottom of the weld. If that happens, then we'll just add a fill pass to the top only. Or you can just add just a little bit of metal by feeding to the top of the weld. All right. Once again, just trying to keep it clean. And every time I do this, I just make sure to get just past the shoulders of the bevel to keep that clean, because we're going to have to go a 1/16 over the shoulder when we put our cap on. Alrighty. So this side's completely filled out. This other side we have another fill pass, and then we'll be ready for the cap. This one might take a couple stitches too. Okay, so on this side, because I need just a tiny bit more wire than the other side, I've picked my wire up just a little bit so it's not contacting the pipe at the very tip. And I'm feeding just a tiny bit of metal into my puddle. Get this thing to fill. Oh, that standing up didn't go so well. So I slipped, I got my wire up against my tungsten when I was standing up there. So, not a big deal. The whole tungsten's still there, so we just got to sharpen it up and we'll be off to the races again. Alrighty.
Can you show the passes real quick, Mom?
Huh?
Can you show the passes?
Yeah. Yep. Let me shove this thing in here. So, here is our last fill. Here is the fill pass right now. And there's the root. You can see inside there. So now I have a little glob right here where I jam that wire in. I'll just knock that down and we'll be off to the races again. Now if you have a little glob to knock down, it's really important that you don't come in too low. The glob will drop onto the tungsten. I'm gonna quick peel some of this off.
How long have you been welding for?
8 years. 8 years now. Okay. We'll fire back up here. Now on the top, it'll filled all the way out. It's just like locking the cup on plate, except for that we're going to have to keep picking our shoulder up so that we don't long arc. It's really easy to long arc as you come around the top because your pipe is always rolling away from you. And so as the pipe rolls away from you, your TIG cup tends to tip back. So you have to always get taller or lean forward. You can change your wrist angle, but that'll mess up your walk sometimes. So I like to just get taller. My stick out was a little too long on that last one. Now we're going to a neutral stick out, which is, if you take this wire like this, you set it on that tip of that tungsten edge of the cup, it should make a perfect triangle. So it means your stick out is exactly the radius of your cup. Now it's time for the cap.
351.
Perfect. So now I'm going to bump this heat down a tiny bit. So the trick to the cap is don't mess up. Be really comfortable so that you can get all the way from the bottom to the top. If you do make a slip during this portion of the weld, it's pretty hard to cover up. It's not the end of the world, but if you're going to do well on one portion, make it be the cap. So I really am going to focus on making sure that my edges line up a 1/16 over the bevel, watching for undercuts. If I start to see it, then I'll tighten up my arc length, and kind of want to get from the bottom to the top as fast as I can. And that usually results in a pretty nice looking weld. We're turned down quite a bit, so we're not going to be able to go super fast because our pipe's super hot right now. And we're ready to go. Now when we put this cap on, we want to go quick through the middle, and then we just creep up on the edges. We don't quite pause, we just slow down. Now if we left the edges of this piece of pipe dirty, right now is when it's going to start messing up our weld. Now, one side note, the end of this rod is extremely hot when you get done, and so if you're not careful and you flip it around and go to slide it down your hand, if that end is up against your belly, it hurts really bad. A lot of people get burned that way. Most people only make the mistake once. But, okay, so there's the cap on that side, and here's the cap on this side, and you can see the fill pass on this side. So I'll quick slip one more cap in here, then this weld will be complete and ready for QC. Okay. On this side, I was starting to bump into that stand, so we'll have to have a restart on it. All right, when we get onto this last tie-in, really tornado it. There we go. There's a 4-inch 5G TIG out. We'll clean it off quick. There it is. Awesome, thanks.